Yan Liang, welcome to BRI Dialogues.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, Anush and I are familiar with your stellar background, but for our audience, I like to take just a short few seconds. I cannot do justice to it, but to share a bit of your background with them. Yan is Peter C. and Bonnie S. Kremer Chair Professor of Economics at Willamette University. She's also a research associate at the Levy Economics Institute, a non-resident senior fellow at the Global Development Policy Center at Boston University, and a research scholar of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. She also specializes in MMT, the modern monetary theory, the political economy of China, economic development, and international economics. And that sets the ground for me asking you one simple question with your in-depth knowledge of MMT. Would it be fair to say that today in the world we live in, maybe no one, but hardly anybody has a monetary sovereignty because of the role of US dollar? Would that be fair to say? That when the Fed decides to change the rates or, quantitative easing, pretty much the whole world has to adjust themselves to US dollar. So through the lens of MMT, do we live or can anybody claim that they have full monetary sovereignty? And without a monetary sovereignty, is there a sovereign state?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I think it really depends on what you looked at, this definition of monetary sovereignty, right? The MMT's position on this is, again, it's controversial, but at the same time, I think right now, I think scholars agree there's a spectrum of monetary sovereignty. So if you define monetary sovereignty as a government that is able to impose tax and other obligations, and to be able to define what this monetary unit is, and receive these monetary things as a payment, right, for tax and other obligations, then I think the great majority of the countries actually do have the kinds of monetary sovereignty. And also in terms of, the government will be able to issue its own money to purchase anything that is for sale denominated in that monetary unit. Then again, many countries in the world, I think most countries in the world the governments do have that ability, right? The extreme cases would be countries that completely give up their sovereign currency, right? Like El Salvador or Ecuador, they are dollarized. So the government doesn't really issue their own currency to purchase anything that is for sale denominated in their own domestic unit of account. But I think the great majority of the countries do have the kinds of sovereignty, right? At least to some degree. But you're absolutely right in terms of policymaking autonomy. We live in a world that dollar has that hegemonic position. So whenever the Fed raises the interest rate and whenever the countries that borrow a lot needs to borrow, they mostly do it in the dollars and they have to adjust the policy according to the Fed's policy, as you just articulated. So I think it's I don't want it to be a sort of doomsayer, right? To say that countries absolutely have no sovereignty. I do think that countries have a tremendous amount of sovereignty, given the real resources that they have, given the capacity of the government to impose certain obligations on their citizens, given the fact that the government does collect taxes and in their own currencies and so on and so forth. I do think that there is a policy space, right? We should not be too self defeating and say, there's nothing we can do as a country.
Right.
But do bear in mind, yes, there are certain policy constraints, and that do a lot of times rely on what kind of exchange rate regimes you adopt and what kind of policy making toolkits you have, and so on and so forth.
I like to challenge you before Anush jumps in, yeah, and just because I believe nobody has decoded it better than you, but doesn't that lack of external sovereign authority and sovereign monetary authority come and manifest itself in trade? Because yes, within my little house I can do whatever I want. The moment I want to do trade with the rest of the world, hardly anybody has monetary sovereignty. What do you think of that?
Right. I think Defining what monetary sovereignty is when it comes to trade. If what you meant is a lot of the global trade, about over 50% is invoiced in dollar, meaning that when countries import, they are measuring the price of their imports in dollars and they have to pay in dollars. If that is what you meant, then yes, over 54% of the global trade is invoiced in the dollar. I think somewhere 50-ish percent, right? But that also means there are half, right, of the global trade is not denominated in the dollars. So I think for countries, this is MMT's position, which is that countries need to strategically invest in their own food, energy, and technology, and some of these essential, goods to cut off or wean off the kinds of reliance on the global market, right? I mean, this very famous saying, the arms and the farms, right? They're not subject to the control over the international market. That is a smart strategy for countries. And I think that's essential strategies. So trade is helpful, right? If you are able to ensure full employment, if you're ensuring your self-reliance on these very essential products, then trade can help to, boost competition, enhance efficiency, and, consumers can get more wide range of selections and so on and so forth. There are these benefits of trade, but there's a big preconditions, right? So these arms and farms, and I would say in today's world technologies, all these things needs to be really, enhanced. Countries need to strategically invest in all those capacities, right? To be able to fend themselves off any, exigencies. But also I think it's just a strategy that, countries, if they want it to be sustainable, right, and sort of resilient, I think, these are the things that you should not rely on trade. Yeah.
So, given what you've said, Liang, so to make this discussion kind of more practically orientated, we've got a new president coming in who seems to be tariff max. He's gonna tariff the whole world by the sounds of things, and that will have a very dramatic direct impact on dollar as a denomination for trade and exchange and so on. The last time when the dollar in this position was during the Reagan era, where the debt of the global South countries just shot up, leading to places like Argentina, Brazil, Chile, almost collapsing. Now, of course, apart from Argentina, the rest of them look at China as provider of a cushion, at least, to protect them from the volatility that is likely to come. So how do you see the impact of Trump's still emerging economic strategy impacting the dollar, and how then the price variations in the dollar is going to affect China and many of the global South countries who are dependent on trade with both China and the United States?
Yeah. So I think, this is a very complex question and, we should unpack it a little bit. So first of all, I think, yes, you're right. The reason that countries rely on the dollar, that has a long history, right? There's economic, geopolitical, and many factors that go into it. So we kind of live in that system where dollar is accounting for, over 60% of, foreign exchange reserves, and then over 50% of the global trade and over 80% of global payments. So dollar is in that really almost, sort of, well, it is a hegemonic position. Trump's tariff, if anything, right? For example, he's threatening the BRICS countries and said, if you guys are moving away from the dollar, I'm going to tax you 100%. Well, this is a self-defeating, obvious self-defeating move, right? If you are levying so much on, the tariffs, you essentially cut off trade with these countries, right? If you're cutting off the trade with these countries, they're not selling to the US anymore, then most likely they're going to veer off and trade with each other, and they could develop the local currency, clearing system and trade system. So it actually facilitate the kind of de-dollarization move that Donald Trump wants to fend off in the first place. So it is a self-defeating strategy. Now, other than sort of the dollar, there are also other other implications, right, with all these tariff threat. For very trade dependent countries, of course, they're worried, right, because they're not able to get access to this biggest market in the world. And of course, because of the dollar's position, the United States is, I would say, the only country that can consistently run very large trade deficit without any sort of exchange rate depreciations and without any income adjustments domestically, right? So I think, for countries that are dependent on trade, be it they need to import a lot or they rely on external demand, these tariffs could be could have significant negative impacts, right? But that said, I don't think that even just by levying these tariffs, Donald Trump can really materialize all these lofty goals about bringing manufacturing back to the United States or create jobs back home and so on and so forth. Because I think for the United States, right, the fundamental problems the United States has is financialization, right? This is where, we all understand that sort of the history, right? That they deregulate the financial sector, and with this runaway financial innovation, quote unquote, the US is pretty much relying on the fire industry to drive the economy, right? When you think about today's world, right? The US accounts for about 1/4 of the world GDP. Their stock market value takes up over 64%, 65% of the stock value. And, so I think, for the United States, if they don't change the way they run the economy, they don't change their, their OMO, just by levying tariffs, it's not going to stop them from importing from the rest of the world. Because the whole logic here, right, is that you financialize, you rely on your competitive advantage of selling your financial asset to the rest of the world and import manufacturing products and, other real resources. So it's an internal driven kind of, strategy. It's not like as many people would say, oh, China is trying all they can to dump the goods in the United States, right? And this is coming from many of the Keynesians or post-Keynesians, right? But if you really believe in demand driving supply story, right, then you have to think about how is China able to supply if there's no demand for it, right? So I think that the complex kind of stories with tariffs is that, yes, it has the implication on the dollar. It could weaken the dollar because other countries will move away from dollar and trade with each other. So that could, in a way weaken the US's own positionality that they try to defend. And on the other hand, I don't think that it could really cut off trade from a global perspective. You might have some trade diversion, right? The country that have the high tariffs may have to find a third way, right? Find a connector country, so to speak. So yeah, that's I think it's a complex story.
That's fantastic, yeah. So, but a devalued dollar would effectively be to the advantage of global South countries who will have to use less of their own currencies to buy the dollars to trade with. So there are these hidden advantages that may follow the administration strategy. But so the debate in particular about China, which is if you like, the country apart from the European Union most affected by what is likely to happen. We still don't know whether it will or not, of course, and so we're speculating. So the debate is that China is so dependent on the American market that they will just roll back on their tummies and accept what comes their way. The other view is that China has been able to build robust relationships, BRI being one of the vehicles for this, with other countries within BRICS in particular now, that it is able to weather some of that tension with the US, but also it may well, in a post-Ukraine war, rebuild relations with Europe. These are all kind of hypothetical questions out there, but they have a degree of reality to them because ultimately China has to shape policies on the basis of what is hearing coming out of the incoming administration and the vibes that it's getting. How do you see China to manage this without what it doesn't want is more tension internationally, but also more tension between China and the United States?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And I think there are also a lot of misconceptions about how much China rely on trade. So first of all, I think, when you look at the China's net, sort of the exports, right? The net sort of, exports minus imports, at least, but in 2023, it's only about 2% of the GDP. Back in 2007, that number has been much higher, right? That's before the global financial crisis, the net, export to GDP ratio was around 10% and hover around that, during that period after 2001 up until 2008. So in that period, I would say, yes, China could be described as a export-led country, right? It relies on, the global demand, the net exports as is external demand support. But that number has really gradually going down since then, right? So I think that has to do with China's own economic strategies. They have been more sort of focusing on domestic investments in the real estate sector after the global financial crisis. But that also has to do with the external environment, right? So basically the global supply chain and external demand have leveled off after the global financial crisis. And so China has to look more inward and to find its domestic demand. And so I think up until 2023, net exports has contributed very little to China's, GDP growth. If you look at the contribution rate, sometimes it's negative because the net export growth less than its domestic demand growth. So that's number one. I think it's important to kind of keep in mind that China is actually not as reliant on the external demand as, many, I would say, either scholars or think tanks or media would like us to believe, right? Now, I would say that 2024 is kind of unusual because we just got the number. China runs about, $1 trillion of trade surplus, right, just last year, which is about 5% of GDP, which is relatively larger compared to the years before. But I think there are very unique reasons for that, right? One is that, of course, domestically, your consumption demand is not as robust as back in 2023. The real estate market continued to adjust downwards, and so people are they're saving the money, $9 trillion worth of increase in bond deposit during the COVID year from 2020 to 2024. So people are saving the heck out of their income, right? They're not spending. So domestic demand is relatively weak. And so I think that accounts for that. But also because of the anticipation of tariffs. So a lot of, I think, the external importers, they are front loading, right? Their goods purchased from China. So I think this 1 trillion is kind of, I think, unusual when you look at really the trend post the global financial crisis. So I think, and China's policymakers absolutely understand that they need to cultivate more and bolster domestic demand, right? This is very clear from their September policy pivot, and they continue on with, proactive fiscal policy. Many policy initiatives have been announced. So I think, China as a big country as it is, right, 17% global GDP, over 130 trillion yuan, right, which is, about 17, 18 trillion dollars of a GDP, they need to rely on domestic market. And there's a huge domestic market for them to explore and so on and so forth. Now, also, I think that this whole idea of the direct bilateral relationship with the United States, I also don't think we should overstate it, right? China's export to the United States used to count about 19% of China's total exports. This is, again, back in 2017, when Trump was in the office the first time, right? This is according to United Nations data. China's exports about 19%, goes to the United States. Today, it's about 14%, right? So there's a lot of trade sort of diversion that goes through Vietnam, goes to Mexico, goes to Central Europe, and so on and so forth, right? They may, excuse me, they may eventually find the final market in the United States. But the point is that China does not need to rely on the bilateral trading relationship with the United States. And finally, I wanted to also make the point that China is now really encouraging its companies to go abroad, especially in some of these targeted industries like EV batteries, right? So in a way, again, that could help to circumvent some of these tariffs implications. And also, I think, again, we don't know what Donald Trump is exactly going to do, but I think with the most recent signs, I think he is recognizing, right, that all the costs of this kinds of tariff hike, right, it's a lose-lose proposition, right? That the U.S. is going to shoulder a lot of the costs. I mean, the households, the manufacturing producers that actually rely on the imports and so on and so forth. So yeah, I'm gonna stop. It's a long story,
No.
but it has many layers that you have to kind of peel off. Yeah.
No, I read today as well that $1 trillion figure, Yan, and it was interesting. And that front loading was part of the analysis, as you so eloquently put it. During the past 8 days, something significant happened, but everybody was first distracted by the New Year, Christmas, holidays, and then with all the developments in the Middle East and the fires in California. But Indonesia joined BRICS as the fourth largest population on planet Earth. And driving economy in ASEAN and so the key question I have for you is that where do you see the next shifting gear among BRICS? Because these are not small players. These are, substantive actors. They're not just coming for the ride of it. Do you think that President Trump, with all of this rhetoric, is doing as an accelerator for the decoupling of BRICS with the United States? Not decoupling in terms of no trade, but more integration, more robust trade and bilateral, multilateral relationships among BRICS nations? Or do you think that he will be able to have some sort of divide and conquer within the BRICS bloc at large? Where is your gut feeling pointing to?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And again, to a great extent, we still need to see what Trump is really going to do when it comes to his foreign policies. We know that he has been making a lot of noises these days, right? They wanted to, include Canada as the 51st state, wants to buy Greenland, and so there are a lot of these kinds of rhetorics at this point. But of course, the rhetorics could have real consequences, right? That we're hearing, Danish Prime Minister, we're hearing Greenland, Prime Minister saying, yeah, we're going to cooperate with you and we'll make sure, that the US strategic interest is being protected, enhanced in some ways. And so I think these rhetorics do matter. And I do think that, developing countries are watching this very closely. And so I think if anything, right, there's always this kinds of a bifurcation kind of debates about what Trump is when it comes to international affairs. One side is saying that he's basically exiting from the world stage, right? He's going to withdraw from WHO. He's going to withdraw from, the Paris Agreement, and he's going to maybe even withdraw from WTO. Who knows, right? So there is one kind of argument that he's basically going to leave the world as it is, and he's going to try to end the war, and so on and so forth. So, in a sense, that some people have this sort of I would say hope, even right? Maybe it's wishful thinking, but we don't know that Trump's going to leave the rest of the world alone, which is a good thing, right? So we don't have to, try to have all these defense up, right, against the Donald Trump's interference and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, I think they're also increasing sort of realization that Trump is not going to just leave us alone, right? He's going to meddle things up. He's going to make things even worse, right, than what it was. Right now, you see this kind of imperialism without any threat of disguise. Right in the past, I mean, the U.S.'s imperialism has been going on for hundreds of years. Right, I mean, since its establishment, right, the U.S. has been interfering, right, waging wars among countries 400 times, in the past, 100 years when they established. So we know the U.S. is never a benevolent actor. It's never a peaceful actor. But now I think that sort of the veil has dropped. Right, Donald Trump is very clear, promise that he can guarantee not using military or economic coercion, right, to get what he wants. So I think that in a way will push the developing countries to move more closely together, right, as a defense strategy. I think it's needed, right, when you have this very hostile player that is dominating the world. What's the rest of us to do is we have to solidify, the power. We have to, remain in solidarity. I think that does help in a way catalyze the kinds of movements towards BRICS or more unified, continental Africa or Latin America. So we're seeing some kinds of, or Asia for that matter, right? We're seeing this kinds of, we kind of have to, build our strengths together kinds of movement. On the other hand, I do think that with the justified pressure coming from Trump, right? Countries would have to think about their strategy. Again, there is sort of this non-alignment, multi-alignment, flexible alignment movements going on as well, right? Countries would say, we don't want to choose sides. And choosing side is a completely, failed proposition that has been proved over time, by history. So countries will be very careful, right, when they think about what we can do so we don't confront the United States directly. You are seeing this move already now in Mexico, for example, right? They have already promised that they're going to investigate more the Chinese investments and Chinese exports to Mexico. I think it was announced yesterday or the day before by the Mexican president.
Right.
So it is interesting when you see this, right? The Mexican president, of course, on the one hand, rhetorically, she is completely fighting against the US's imperialism kind of rhetoric, right? Mexican has been saying, the drug war isn't really not on us. The drug war is on you. The immigration crisis is not manufactured by us, it's by you, United States. You have to be responsible for that, right? She also, talked about, what Mexico is not going to be part of the United States. The United States is part of the, the continental, sorry, the American Mexican. I don't know. I don't know how to speak Spanish, so pardon me about that. I think she is pushing back at the areas that she needs to, but she's also caving in, I think, in some ways, right? So then you don't confront directly with the United States. I mean, face it, the United States is still holding so much power that you can't simply just ignore or confront directly. So I think, I see the pressure and the incentives for countries to get together, but at the same time, I think they would employ all the tactics they need. So then they don't seem to picking the sides on the side of China, right? They need to kind of really maneuver, in that space.
Yeah, it's in IR literature we call it omnibalancing, Yan, and it's a very
exactly,
but it's a very difficult thing to do, pending where you sit geographically and where you sit geopolitically. So yeah, I mean, there's interesting times, as they would say in China. So earlier you referred to tariffs and manufacturing. I want to take us back there just briefly, Yan. The Biden administration built a strategy on the Inflation Reduction Act to reshore, if you like, manufacturing of the new type. In fact, our government in Britain is thinking in the same manner, though without the resources that Biden was able to put towards the IRA, right? And again, it remains a question about what Trump is going to do with all of those incentives that the Biden administration put out there to reshore technologies, in particular, coming back into the United States. If it doesn't provide incentives that Biden administration did, the likelihood that those companies will go where the money is, right? And if there are tariffs to come on top of that, I see that as huge opportunity for China to try and pivot away much of what went to America, not so much bring it to China, but create this other kind of, a Sinocentric economic community with which China can continue to grow these new technologies without that negative American pressure from pull and the push systems that Biden was trying to apply. So do you see the dynamics of Trump's economic strategy playing out in ways that would begin to unpick IRA to the advantage of China ultimately?
Yeah, I think again there are many layers in your statement. I think a couple of things. So first of all, I think when you said the UK government doesn't have the resources, I think what UK government is lacking is really the political capital, the political will. As far as budget deficit and fiscal spending is concerned, I don't think UK is constrained. But of course, with decades of deindustrialization and financialization, I think the real resources could be a problem, right? But if the US can pass the budget to fund the IRA, I don't think there's anything that would prevent the UK from doing this, given it still uses pound, right? Last time I checked. But yeah, I think the real resources and also, just the political will is the problem. Now, going to the question about IRA, I think, if anything, Trump is promising to or pledging to, rescind the unspent funds. So he does not believe, at least on the face value, right, the kinds of industrial policy. He believes in deregulation, let the market run its own course, and so government stop interfering. But I agree with you in some ways that what the IRA does is it does create a kind of competitiveness, right, of the US's sort of the incentives and allure investors to come. And I think many of the European businesses, they wanted to invest in the US to take advantage of the incentives. And so I think it does kind of put some pressure on many of other countries, not just China, but many European countries and so on and so forth. So in terms of China creating its own kind of technological space, I think it's already happening, right? And that partly because of industrial policies like IRA, but also part of it just the US's technological containment, measures, right? The so-called small yard height fence, that they scrutinize, investments into the Chinese tech industries. They ban the, semiconductor chips used to be just a high end, but now even legacy, and also, the lithographic, machinery and to China. And so in a way, it forces China, right, that it has to have the so-called whole nation process, the whole nation system, to build, the semiconductor industries, the AI, and so on and so forth, because, China does not have the access, right, to these things that the US used to be able to, provide. And so I think to China, this is actually a strategic gift. It's a space that it's created, right, for the domestic companies like SMIC, right, the Shanghai Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, that many of these companies like Huawei and so on and so forth used to import, chips, and now they use domestically made chips by these companies. So I think, yes, in a way, when you have this kinds of containment policies, you just essentially create incentives and the space for some of the indigenous, technological innovations. And I think, for other countries, this should be the same thing. The governments should provide certain incentives. But I think more importantly, public investment, right? That you need to make sure that you invest in this critical infrastructure so that it can crowd in the private investments, right? In China, why people are using so much EVs? Well, charging stations are everywhere. 1.8 million public charging stations, right? Why people are using so much EV? Well, electricity is dirt cheap. It's 4 cents a dollar in China, right? The lowest one that I could see is Mexico, 5 cents. I don't know how they do it. I need to do some research. But, it's much, much more affordable for people to charge the EVs, and not to mention all these, high-speed railways that connect everywhere. So you don't need to drive very far. It's not like the United States. You need to worry about driving from the East Coast to the West Coast. In China, you drive to the, high-speed rail, you park your car, you can take on the train, come back. And it's just the whole ecosystem, I think, that really it's attributable to the government's public investment, public finance. And so I think, with or without the external pressure, countries should look inward and use all these policies, right, to cultivate their own domestic industries and so on and so forth. But the United States' containment policies and their industry policies could, I think, usher in even more momentum for countries to do that. Now, I would also make the argument that these kinds of industrial policy to support green technology, green products, green energies, I think it's great. I think countries should get into this race to the top kind of moves. So I don't really see. I mean, I don't blame the United States for having IRA. I think it's a good thing for the United States, and I think it's a good thing for the world. I mean, I honestly think when it comes to this kinds of competitive industrial policy, the more the better, because we need that for the world. So that's sort of, again, it's a long answer.
No, but a great answer. And earlier in the program, you were talking about all the veils have come off. There is a myth story, the dance of 7 veils. I think United States has 1 or 2, and Donald Trump has moved them off in one move. But I wouldn't like to see him without any veils. That's a different story. But
I agree.
Yeah, but what I wanted to say is that there is as well this element of awareness as a prelude to my next question, because China's containment has always been around that, certain companies have certain relationships with the party, with the military and that establishment. But in the United States, I mean, you have that, hybrid position of Amazon, of, Google, of Microsoft. So the key question is hypocrisy and the double standards. It's not that one is good, one is bad. I think the world is starting to see some of these things rightly, as you said, about that, hey, monetary or military, I'm going to take Greenland. So that brings me to the next question. And I love you to expand on it as much as you want. And that is this Bitcoin reserve, strategic reserve, and the digital currencies. And within that bigger sphere of monetary ecosystem, is this another soundbite? And given the electricity required for mining Bitcoin, and given that about 80% of the machines in the world that do the mining come from China, does United States really has a fair shot? Or again, it will be through seizure of existing Bitcoin from one country, blocking El Salvador's Bitcoin, blocking, where is this reserve is supposed to come from?
Yeah. So first of all, I really need to differentiate Bitcoin versus the CBDC.
Correct. Yeah.
So
Central bank digital
yes,
currencies. Correct.
right. The central bank digital currency is, potentially could be a currency because again, this is backed by the state, right? Backed by its taxing power. It has a centralized but distributed ledger, whereas Bitcoin to me is simply a speculative financial asset. It has nothing to do with currency. It has nothing to do with money. Um, so I think there is a distinction between the two, right? Bitcoin, it can never be a currency if the United States government doesn't say, we're going to accept Bitcoin to pay your tax obligations. It's not going to be a means of, payments and so on and so forth. It's not going to be money. It's not going to be a unit of account because when we count, Bitcoin, we're always saying, oh, it's now $93,000 per Bitcoin, right? With the fluctuations of the values and also with this whole speculative mania behind, it is a speculative asset that is very environmental destructive, as you just mentioned, right? That's why China banned it, right? Long time ago, a few years back. Now, the CBDC, I think, is a different story. Again, there is a central clearing system that is backed by the states, and the government is behind this. And so the closest the protocol is the Ambridge. I think what we has mentioned this in his show here. That has Thailand, UAE, Hong Kong, and Chinese government behind to develop this kinds of, central bank currency and a central bank linked kind of clearing system. Now, I could see that being developed further. We know the BIS has exited the initiative, but it doesn't mean this project is going to die off. I think countries will continue to build on it. Now, there are definitely many, I would say, the infrastructure, the legal and some other sort of structure needs to be built before this can materialize, right? And so, for example, who are going to be really the dealer that can be included in the system? What is the dispute mechanism, and what is the legal protection of your data privacy, and so on and so forth? There are many things that you have to build up before that can be really utilized as a functional system. But I do see that countries seem to want to move towards that because of, again, the US weaponized its dollar system, right? So this is the way I see it. I think it could be a functional system if it is really backed by the states and developed by the states, and it is a really a sort of a currency, right, in a digital form, as supposed to be a decentralized. There's just no clearing system. There's only just over trading based on really your speculative value, sort of expectation on that on the Bitcoin or other crypto coins. So this is sort of my I would say my understanding of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you find a quote by any chance anywhere, send it to me because you don't believe in it. I'm gonna sit on it. Not that I hold any Bitcoins, but just for the sake of it. I in a speculative world, some days I feel stupid for not having bought at 1,500 a
I
few.
know.
But that is the hindsight, how do you say, dilemma. But I would like to bring our conversation to a closure, albeit the fact that we would like to go on with you and invite you for sure back to the program. But being mindful that you're just in the morning at your end, 9 a.m., 9:30, 9:40, whatever. We don't want to keep you too long. What would be your parting shot piece of advice on the ascendancy of President-elect Donald Trump to cinephobes and to cinephiles. If you were to leave each camp with one piece of advice, what would that be?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think what I would say is play the long game, right? Donald Trump will be in office for 4 years. And of course, there could be a second Donald Trump. We don't know. But I think for any countries in the world, right, focus domestically, build your alliances, build your regional partners, build, your global South solidarity, and focus on domestically, right? Use the policy space you have, use the policy toolkit you have, use the domestic resources you have, provide jobs, decent jobs to your people, strategically invest in your food, energy, technology. Those are the things I think countries really should focus on. The only way that you could really defend yourself is to fortify your own domestic economy. And so this is actually borrowing from, the United States. You compete from a position of strength. And I think that is actually true. Yeah. So play the long game. I don't think, countries should just look at what Donald Trump says one day and does the other day, because you do need to kind of preemptively, right? Like, I think China is now saying that, well, we're going to use all these policies. We're going to just, make sure that we are, keeping ourselves in a strong position. So no matter what happens, no matter what Donald Trump wants to do, we can rely on our domestic resources, domestic market, right? Our regional and our global partners. And I think, if anything, if Trump really, does what he pledges to do, he is going to isolate, the United States from airlines, from, all its important, global partners. And so I think that it's important to bear in mind.
Professor Yan, that is absolutely sound advice that you could give, not just to countries, but also to individuals. I think it is a 4 years of turmoil in one form or another. And we are already beginning to see preemptively, as you rightly say, some of the consequences of it. Now, whether he feels like staying in office for 4 years or not, I think is an open question. But let that lie for the moment. But we've really enjoyed talking with you and listening to you, Yan, because of the insights you provided on so many different levels that we've been talking about, whether it is about global financial arrangements, whether it is about the way in which tariffs affect currencies, the pros and cons of looking at dollar strengths from both the American, but also the Chinese and also the global South perspectives, are all just breath of fresh air for us to be able to hear such clear analysis on so many fronts, and for you to have such firm command of both the American superpower and the emerging Chinese superpowers positions in the world is to behold. So we are really grateful for you to sharing your insights with us, Yan, but also to give us such sound advice to Ali's final question. I couldn't agree more with you. You're right. People have got to play the long game in order to be able to learn to benefit from opportunities that present themselves. So thank you so much, Yan.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you've been so kind and generous. I know that there's still a lot that I could and I should learn, but thank you so much for the encouragement, the support, and also the invitation. I enjoyed the conversation. Yes.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Yes. Bye.